Welcome everyone, Mike Fave here. Today I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. Instead of going purely over studies, I wanted to bring some more practical application for you guys, and I'm going to go over one of my clients' labs. Now, obviously, I removed all the personal information, so I'm not going to be showing anything about who this person is. They're okay with me using their labs. We're just going to call this individual John for now. And what we're going to do is I'm going to show you the value of looking at this individual's labs and then corroborating it with elements of his diet in Chronometer. When I work with clients personally, I use both Chronometer and I will use lab work as necessary. So again, this, as far as John's situation here, John and I had been working together for a bit. We made some pretty significant improvement overall in his health and his symptom profile. The last thing to really adjust was he was dealing with some fatigue. So we decided, why not? Let's get some labs. Let's see what's going on. And so this is the actual lab profile that we got. So we're going to go through the labs here. I'm going to bring in some studies. There are some values here that I'm not, that I would like to see improve. But and we'll talk about why those values are what they are. But in the meantime, most of these labs are actually pretty good overall. So first things first, we're going to look at this lipid profile. So the lipid profile for John is pretty great overall. Everything's within range. Doesn't mean anything, but as far as being in range, it's pretty solid. Now, triglycerides, they're great, and this is going to be, we'll see when we get to what John's diet actually is, that it's probably going to be pretty surprising that his triglycerides are at this level, considering his level of carbohydrate intake in the form of sugar. Now, it's not granulated sugar, it's fruit and fruit juice, but you'll see that it's not, the fruit and fruit juice isn't raising triglycerides ridiculously or cholesterol or altering fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C values. What we're really going to be seeing is that it's actually, with these whole food, it's not even about whole food, but I guess whole food, fruit, carbohydrate sources, the body seems to tolerate them pretty well, at least here for John. He doesn't have any other underlying metabolic syndrome or anything along those lines. We'll come down here. So usually people will say that VLDL is one of the better indicator of cardiovascular disease than just pure LDL. Values are fine for John here at 16. Now, as far as lipid panel goes, total cholesterol 143. Not surprised. John works out pretty consistently. His diet is pretty solid overall. It's nutrient dense. It's largely from whole foods, fruits, veggies, meat, seafood. Not so much seafood. Actually, doesn't really like seafood. But a decent amount of meat and whatnot. HDL all looks good, and then LDL all looks good as well. So overall, John's lipid profile looks good. And as we get a little bit lower, we'll see that John is trending towards a hypothyroid state, and despite that, his cholesterol profile actually looks pretty good. So as we move down, we get to his comprehensive metabolic panel, or CMP, and what we're seeing, fasting glucose 87, which is great. Kidney function's fine, and then the electrolyte panel and his liver function is okay as well. So usually when I get labs to somebody, I do recommend that they get a CBC, which is a complete blood count, and a CMP, which is a comprehensive metabolic panel. They're pretty cheap overall, not too expensive to get both. And they do offer some general values that can be helpful, looking at liver function like albumin, globulin, bilirubin, ALT, AST. Also show kidney function. Most people I work with don't have any aberrations in the majority of these values. Usually you see the aberrations with more acute situations, or like with people in the hospital, not necessarily the normal healthy person walking around on the street. Now, normal healthy person walking around on the street doesn't necessarily mean you don't have health situation going on. It's just when you start to get electrolyte imbalances or like gross abnormalities in liver function, there's usually something more acute going on or a more serious situation. So yeah, usually these are pretty fine, but it's pretty cheap to do, and it gives you some value. Like when we look at parathyroid hormone, having the calcium value here is important. So yeah, just good indicators. This doesn't really, the potassium values and sodium values, usually they're not too far off. So let's get to the next page here. the PDF reader, let's see. So it's put them into 2 pages. So I'm going to move over here. So you'll notice here that alkaline phosphatase, this is an enzyme produced in the intestine, involved in mineral balance and also detoxifying endotoxin. For John, it's actually quite low. This could be lowered by vitamin D, calcium, magnesium supplementation. John is supplementing all of those, and his vitamin D is on the higher end, so I'm not surprised at this value. So again, I don't think this is quite a big deal, this lowered alkaline phosphatase. Usually a higher value is indicative of more issues than the lower value. These labs over here, we have AST and ALT. These are markers of liver function. They're enzymes that are in the hepatocytes or the liver cells, and when you get liver damage, they'll leak out. The values for John here are great. As far as hemoglobin A1C, John's at 5.0. This is a fine hemoglobin A1C, especially considering fasting glucose is fine. I did want to see insulin, but we didn't get insulin. This whole panel actually wound up being pretty expensive, so we trimmed down some of the options. But I would assume insulin is also on the lower end, considering the A1C and the fasting glucose. And then if we look at like uric acid and things like that, we're not seeing any gross elevation. So and also with the lipid profile, I would assume that the overall metabolic function is pretty solid. Now, these labs aren't all in order, so I just want to briefly mention the uric acid here at 6.2, so mid-range. John eats quite a large amount of fructose. So for all of the fructose is the devil proponents, because it raises uric acid and depletes ATP at the liver, we're not seeing this in John's case. He's right at 6.2 despite almost 400 grams of sugar intake per day, which is, he should technically have full-blown metabolic syndrome at this point from a low-carb perspective, but he's actually doing pretty solid. Besides that, so that would cover our metabolic profile overall. What we're going to look at now is PTH. So this is looking at calcium regulation. I generally want to see PTH less than 30. So John's at 27. And I want to see vitamin D usually between 30 and 50, probably closer towards the 50. So John, we'll see his vitamin D in just a bit in these labs, but his parathyroid hormone is solid at the 27. And also he doesn't have super high serum calcium, and his vitamin D levels is solid as well. So his calcium balance is great. The supplementation and dietary interventions that we put in place are working. Phosphate is also fine mid-range. As far as thyroid function, this is one of the areas where John and I need to improve. John's TSH is in range. However, it is much higher than I want it to be. Ideally, I want it less than 2. I'm going to cover a study in just a few minutes discussing this specific, the TSH value in specific. Something I want to just tangentially bring up here is that just because a value is in range doesn't mean that value is optimized. And so the TSH is actually a good place to discuss this, because the TSH range used to be up to like 8 or 10 micro IU per liter, or a milli IU per liter. So and they had to actually adjust that downward now to the top end of the range being 4, because they started to realize that the 8 or the 10 TSH value was actually pathologic, or was not a good sign for thyroid function and other factors as well. So they adjusted it downward. But more research is starting to show that perhaps it should be even lower. In the study that I'm going to discuss, they talk about TSH of healthy people being, I think, around 1.5 or 1.15. We'll see in the study. I forget off the top of my head. And then, so we'll talk about that in just a sec. So the TSH is higher than I'd like. Well, also, I'm going to bring up and show why this could be elevated in the diet because of factors in John's diet. As far as T3 or T4 total, he's in the lower end of the range. Not surprising. His overall thyroid function is trending towards a lower direction, so not ideal, but it's, I think, correctable. Not even necessarily requiring thyroid supplementation. I think there's a chance that this can be corrected even without thyroid supplementation. As far as T3, also on the lower end of the range. I'd want to see both T3 and T4 in the upper end of the range, and TSH less than 2. That would be my ideal with somebody who's not supplementing thyroid. If they are supplementing thyroid, I want both these in the higher end of the range and TSH suppressed pretty strongly, at least personally. So And the next lab we have here was dihydrotestosterone. We wanted to see how John was converting between estrogen and DHT. He's about mid-range dihydrotestosterone. It matches his testosterone level, which was slightly on the lower side. We'll talk about why that could be in conjunction with the thyroid panel, because I think they go hand in hand. So we'll see that in just a few minutes. But dihydrotestosterone here, not too bad, about mid-range. So we're going to slide over here. Next thing we looked at was a complete blood count. I usually like to see a complete blood count in conjunction with an iron panel. Reason why, first of all, having the complete blood count will tell you if you have any underlying infection going on, if WBCs are slightly elevated or in the top end of the reference range. But then the other thing is the CBC can tell you about the hemoglobin and hematocrit levels, so that you can determine if it is safe for you to donate blood if your iron values or your iron panel is showing increased levels of iron. So in this case, John's hemoglobin hematocrit is top end of the range, 16.3 and 49.6. So he should be fine to donate blood. And then if we slide down here to the iron panel, usually for ferritin, I like to see less than 100. So John can go ahead and donate blood and shouldn't have a problem. He's not iron overloaded by any means, but he does have a bit of iron on board. He does eat red meat every single day for years now. So he's actually not doing pretty well overall, considering the amount of red meat he eats on a regular basis. He's not really super iron overload or anything. Saturation is fine. Ferritin's only is okay. Iron binding capacity and serum iron all look okay. I just want to bring this ferritin down just a little bit. And he does have room with his hemoglobin hematocrit to donate blood and not move into anemic territory. Now, in certain other clients that I've worked with, they've had iron overload situation where their saturation was quite high, and then their ferritin was quite high, and their hemoglobin hematocrit was actually borderline anemic, so they couldn't donate right away. This happened a few times from carnivores. I think that I've also seen people with hemochromatosis, and they've coming off a carnivore diet, and then their hemoglobin hematocrit are okay, but their ferritin and their saturation is sky high, and so that having a very high ferritin or a large amount of iron stored in the body is quite problematic, because the iron can increase oxidative stress inside the body, and it can worsen risk for infections, because iron is used by microbes for their metabolic processes. So the body will try to sequester all that iron and ferritin. So getting the iron down at a certain level is helpful in the long term. There's some associations and possible mechanisms with iron overload and cardiovascular disease. So just something to keep in mind. You want to make sure your iron's not too high. You also want to make sure it's not too low. If your ferritin is too low and your hemoglobin hematocrit are too low, you probably won't feel very good. You can cause thyroid issues with too low iron. Antioxidant status can be compromised with not having enough iron, since many of the enzymes in the body require iron overall. So just something to keep in mind. A nice balance of iron in the body is important. Other thing you can see here, absolute eosinophils are low here. Now, John is working out regularly. That can possibly lower these. They're not too low. They're just a little bit below the reference range. I don't think this is anything to worry about, unless you're seeing continued value here, and then consider like a chronic infection. But as far as we know, we're not seeing any chronic infections in John's case. So overall, you can get with your CBC and your iron panel, you can see how you're doing hemoglobin hematocrit wise. You can look at what's going on with your iron stores in your body. You can manage those. You can see if you have any underlying infections going on, looking at WBCs. So yeah, it's a good. And then also, if you had any other types of anemias, like an iron-based anemia, or like a pernicious, a B12 anemia, or any type of B vitamin related anemia, you can also get a sense of what's going on there by looking at some of these other values in the CBC. So it can be quite helpful to have a CBC if you are struggling with anemia or iron overload, in conjunction with having an iron panel. So next values we have here are DHEA, cortisol, and then there is testosterone a little bit lower. DHEA is about mid-range, not too bad. Cortisol is in range. However, it is towards the upper end of the range. So I'd want this cortisol just a bit lower, probably closer to mid-range, not towards the upper end of the range. Now, what we're going to talk about in one of these studies is cortisol does elevate in a hypothyroid state. So in this situation, it's possible that this cortisol will actually come down when the thyroid situation is corrected for John here. So my anticipation is that the fixed thyroid, it'll bring down cortisol, and you also see an increase in testosterone. Next thing, so the other thing is you can look at ratios between testosterone and cortisol and DHEA and cortisol, and you can get an understanding of the anabolic to catabolic balance going on in the body. So with this current setup, John isn't like excessively catabolic or anything like that, but he's also not pushing heavily more towards the anabolic side. Now, he does train in the gym 4 to 6 days a week, so that could also be responsible for some of these values that we're seeing if he is like training or having too much volume on his body on a consistent basis. But it could also be a function of the thyroid. So these are just hypotheses to consider and factors to adjust, and then reevaluate labs and see where you're at. And again, you don't have to do this whole thing. Maybe you just redo an iron panel after donating blood, do a cortisol and testosterone and DHEA again, and then also redo a thyroid panel. So you wouldn't have to redo everything. We'll get to the testosterone in just a sec with sex hormone binding globulin and FSH and LH. One thing I want to talk about here. So one of the best risk markers to look at for cardiovascular disease is lipoprotein A, or LP little a. This lipoprotein is strongly associated with cardiovascular disease. Now, in John's case, he's less than 10, so he's not even close to being at high risk for cardiovascular disease here. Considering all of his other markers, as far as his cholesterol and metabolic function, he's actually doing great. Only thing is, again, fix the thyroid function. There are associations between a hypothyroid state, although it's usually an overt hypothyroid state and not necessarily a subclinical hypothyroid state, which John would be trending more towards subclinical hypothyroidism and less towards overt. There's associations between overt hypothyroidism and cardio or atherosclerosis and heart disease. So in this case, John's risk right now is very minimal. He's doing great on that front. And I think he'll continue to do well considering the diet that we built out and his current lab values. Now, as far as his FSH and LH, these are hormones coming from the pituitary, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone that stimulate the production of sperm and also stimulate the production of testosterone from the testicles. Usually you don't want to see these all the way in the upper end of the reference range. You don't want to have these high pituitary values. It's basically, that's your pituitary saying to your testicles, hey boys, come on, we need to make some testosterone. So I don't think that he's having this increased pituitary function. I'm happy with these values here. I think the testosterone situation, again, he's not super low, he's mid-range, but I think it could be improved by improving thyroid and lowering cortisol a bit. Also maybe dropping prolactin a bit, which we'll see in a second. So next page here, we have sex hormone binding globulin, which is 34, mid-range. I think this is fine. Prolactin is 8.8. So usually I like to see it less than 7, although 8.8 isn't really that bad. If you're like 12 or 10 and up, I would really want to see that come down for a man. So prolactin essentially is also a pituitary hormone or hypothalamic pituitary hormone. And what it can do is it can lower your production of sex steroids. It basically shuts down the entire sex steroid axis to a large extent. So bringing prolactin down can improve sex steroid values as well. When we get to testosterone here, John is on the lower end. I definitely would want to see this maybe like 700 and above. This and the thyroid can be part of the fatigue symptoms that he's experiencing a bit. I think once correcting thyroid and minimizing cortisol, we'll start to see this testosterone value increase. And so again, we'll retest this after maybe a month or two of the interventions that we're going to put in place. And again, I'm going to pull up some studies to discuss some of the relationships, and also we'll look at John's diet on Chronometer. So overall, testosterone mid-range. I'd like to see it close, at least 700. He's in his 20s. I think this is a function of the other things going on. I don't think he just like has a random low T. I don't think he needs to supplement testosterone either. I think that he needs to maybe bring prolactin down a bit, bring cortisol down a bit, and improve thyroid function, and you'll see this testosterone level increase a bit. Last thing we have here, vitamin D and estradiol. So this is ultra sensitive estradiol. John's estrogen levels are not high by any means. So the testosterone that he is producing looks like it's converting well to DHT, and it's not being heavily aromatized. So this is not a bad thing. As far as his vitamin D goes, his vitamin D level is higher than I would want to. He is supplementing vitamin D, so bringing his vitamin D supplementation down just a bit. I think he was taking 4,000 or 5,000 IU because his last value was lower. I generally prefer people use it orally because I've seen it bring their levels up higher. So he's actually too high now, and I would drop him down for a bit, maybe to 1,000 or 2,000 IU as like maintenance, because it is a winter now, and I think by the time he's done, his vitamin D level should probably come down to like closer to 50 or in the 40s. That would be my hope. And again, we'll retest, see where he's at, and then adjust his dosing again from there. But yeah, this is overall, it's not terrible. I don't want him to get too high because you have a risk of hypercalcemia, but his parathyroid suppressed and his vitamin D function is doing pretty well overall. So overall, John's labs look pretty good. The main things to address are decrease the ferritin a bit with some blood donation, lower the cortisol a bit, lower TSH, improve T4, T3, and then also improve the testosterone value here. Now, what I want to do is I want to get to look at John's diet, and we can explain why he's experienced some of these things, and then we'll talk about some of the research as well or underpinnings as far as the different theories that we're thinking about here. So let me get to these. All right, so this is John's diet. This is what we built out together. He's been running this for a couple months now. Before this, he was doing a little bit more starch in the form of white rice. We actually found he tolerated fruits better and sugars better, so we switched him over towards those from the starches. His digestion improved, energy improved. The one thing you'll notice here is John has quite a bit of cauliflower and broccoli consumption. These were his preferred vegetables when we started working together. I personally thought that it was okay as long as he was boiling these for an extended period of time. However, considering his most recent lab values, I think minimizing broccoli and cauliflower will be important for improving John's thyroid function and subsequently improving his androgens and lowering his cortisol a bit. And I'm going to talk about some of those relationships in just a second. But essentially, the problem I think here is, first of all, the main thing is the thyroid function with John. I think he's having a large volume of cruciferous vegetables every day, between 12 and 16 ounces. So a pound to three-quarters of a pound to a pound of cruciferous vegetables a day. We are boiling them for 20 minutes, which per the research should be minimizing any like goitrogenic effect. Goitrogens are compounds that can inhibit thyroid function. But with the sheer volume, I think that's probably the issue here with John. Then the other thing is John doesn't like seafood at all, so he doesn't get a decent amount of iodine in his diet. Now, here, let me unclick this here. The iodine values in Chronometer aren't shown. They're not in a lot of the databases, so you don't get a good element here. Essentially, a solution for John, since he doesn't like seafood, is just use a very small amount of kelp powder in one of these meals. I don't want him to go over 1 milligram of iodine a day, but I want him to increase his iodine just a bit. The reason why is the broccoli and cauliflower basically inhibit the uptake of iodine into the thyroid gland. So I just want him to make sure he gets a little bit of extra iodine, and he also doesn't use iodized salt, so his iodine intake is low. I don't want to do too much iodine, though, because too much iodine can increase oxidative stress at the thyroid and can also cause can also lead to a hypothyroid effect through something called the Wolff-Chaikoff effect, where excess iodine shuts down the transport of iodine into the thyroid gland as well. So just a very small amount on a consistent basis to over time bring things back up. I'm looking at things on not a 1 to 2 or 3 week turnaround. I'm looking in like the 1 to 3 month range. I want to see these things correct. I don't want to do any massive dangerous experimentations with super high iodine or anything like that. I want to do just a small amount to replete him without creating any subsequent issues. The other thing when we do this is I want to make sure he has adequate antioxidants on board. That's vitamin E, that's vitamin C, that's some of the plant compounds. That's making sure that his mineral intake is topped off so all the antioxidant iodine, enzymes can function appropriately. And I want to minimize too much polyunsaturated fats so that he doesn't have excess lipid peroxidation, the antioxidant enzymes function appropriately, and he has adequate antioxidants on board. So when you add iodine, you minimize the risk of oxidative stress inside the thyroid. So that's part of our strategy here. Now, some things I want to point out separate from the thyroid axis situation is John is eating almost 400 grams of net carbohydrate, all in the form of sugar except for 8 grams of starch. So when we consider John's triglycerides and his lipid profile and his blood glucose handling, we're not seeing insulin resistance. We're not seeing move towards metabolic syndrome. He's been eating this way for months. If anything, his values have improved in those areas. So I think that overall, and I see this time and time again, I'm not seeing carbohydrates causing metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance or anything along those lines. If anything, the 400 grams of sugars have improved John's metabolic function. His values look great. And then also he's not seeing super elevated uric acid despite you have 88 grams. So you have 90 grams of fructose here. And then you have another 70 grams of fructose because sucrose is half fructose, half glucose. So he's at about 150 to 60 grams of fructose a day without severe elevations of uric acid or indications of metabolic aberrations. So all this fructose fear, I'm not seeing it. I haven't really seen it in my clients' labs. I haven't seen it in my own labs. Again, the fructose sources here are juice and whole fruits. So this is dried pineapple, orange juice, strawberries, banana, pineapple juice. So again, the sources here are all whole, like very quality juice sources and whole and dried fruits. So I don't think there's, again, I'm not seeing problems with that. I think that those theories are bunk. If you wanted to use 400 grams of pure sucrose as like granulated cane sugar, then I think you'd see more issues. But with this so far, it's okay. And then as far as supplementation wise, these are the supplements we currently have on board that are topping off his nutrients. One of the main nutrients that we were missing was vitamin E and calcium. So those are the main things to supplement. And then vitamin D you don't usually get through the diet. This is our current. It should actually be a little lower now at 1,000, 2,000 IUs per day. And then the vitamin K here is also from Thorne as well, 800 micrograms. So nutrients are topped off across the board. He's mostly his carbohydrate intake is mostly sugars. Fat intake, also something interesting, his fat intake is mostly saturated fat. He has some monos. It looks like almost 2-to-1 saturated to monounsaturated, and an almost 10-to-1 saturated to polyunsaturated. Those are the values that I like to shoot for, and I like to keep the polyunsaturated at 4 grams per 2,000 calories. So we're at 3,000 calories here, which would give us 6 grams per day. John is currently at 5.4 grams, so only 3.3 grams of omega-6 and then 1 gram of omega-3, and that's mostly from the cooked vegetables. So again, he's doing pretty well as far as his PUFA intake, which is partly why I think some of his metabolic function is functioning so well. Last thing, I guess, just to briefly discuss here is I like to, for people to have adequate amount of glycine in their diet, there is a study looking at glycine requirement in humans. I will do a video on it, and basically I think it winds up being ballpark 0.2 grams per kilogram of body weight for glycine. So I'd actually want to see John's glycine intake a little higher. We could possibly bump up collagen. I know it's a bit tangential to what we're looking at here, but his glycine intake is great, especially because he's at almost 3 times as much glycine as methionine. So looking at those ratios are also important. Now, what do we do to fix John's situation? So again, I like to go with simple fixes first, and then see where we're at before we start getting into these like, oh, you need thyroid, you need this, you need that, whatever the situation is. And just as a side note, I cannot prescribe or recommend thyroid. That's out of my scope of practice. I can only educate people on thyroid usage and things along those lines with my nursing degree. But essentially what we did was we took out the cruciferous vegetables, took out the broccoli and cauliflower. We switched in peas. So he's still getting the fibers, which were helping his gut. It's not a starchy fiber. It's just again, it's like a vegetable fiber. Peas are technically a legume, but they have very minimal anti-nutrients, very minimal lectins, pretty well tolerated by most people. They don't have any oxalic or high amounts of oxalic acid or goitrogenic compounds. So they're pretty well tolerated. So we did peas. There's also squash. I didn't put it on here. I copied down John's chronometer here on this page, so none of his information would be shown. So we switched out the peas, took out the cruciferous vegetables. He's still hitting his same fiber amount. He's about 45 grams here. On the previous day, he was at about 39 grams, so his fiber's about the same. The peas add maybe a little extra protein, a little extra carb content. Yeah, he's at 420 now. They add about 32 grams of carbs. So overall, the macros and calories are roughly the same. Intake is roughly the same. The other thing that we did, as I mentioned, was just added a bit of kelp powder. Now, kelp doesn't show iodine in chronometer here. So let's see. Grams. I'm going to put 1 gram. But there is a company that does sell like this powdered kelp. It's, I think, like the Maine seaweed. It's a guy from Maine who produces this different seaweed, and 1 teaspoon has like 1 milligram of iodine, which is ridiculous. I think a teaspoon is 3 or 4 grams. So I only want John to get like 1 gram of this kelp just in one meal a day, just consistently over time. I don't want him to overdose. Like 200 to 300 micrograms should be a safe amount, and use that consistently. 1 milligram probably shouldn't be a problem, but I would want to stay on the safe side considering his current TSH values, T3, T4. So those were the adjustments that we made to John's diet. Just, again, very simple solutions. I'm not trying to create ridiculous stacks. I've covered his nutrient bases. He's feeling pretty well overall with just the dietary change. So I don't think, if he's doing well overall and he just has this fatigue and it's related to the hypothyroid or the borderline hypothyroid situation, then let's see if we can correct that without doing anything too severe. Retest, see how he's doing symptomatically over the next couple weeks, and then go from there. Now, the studies I wanted to bring up for you guys. So first one, this study is effects of cooking methods on total isothiocyanate yield from cruciferous vegetables. So isothiocyanates are the compounds in cruciferous vegetables that can lead to the hypothyroid state. And basically, there's a couple papers on this. What I want to do is zoom in, or actually I have the graph over here. So what they did in this study was they took the different cruciferous, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, kale. They cooked them in different ways and saw the change in the isothiocyanate content of these vegetables. So when we initially talked, I thought that the broccoli and cauliflower wouldn't be as much of an issue if he was boiling these vegetables for a long period of time. As we see, the isothiocyanate content can decrease pretty precipitously. Broccoli and a decent amount in cauliflower with the boiling situation. It's about the same on average, or also like a stewing situation. So I thought that minimizing them to a large extent, he would be below the threshold. But apparently it wasn't as much as I thought, or maybe his intake was too high. So that's why we're decreasing them, and then we'll retest his labs to see if those indeed were the cause. Other thing I guess I wanted to point out here. So this study, just so you guys can see, this study is role of dietary iodine in cruciferous vegetables and thyroid cancer, a countrywide case control study in New Caledonia. So New Caledonia is an island in the South Pacific, or in the Pacific. There's a high incidence of thyroid issues, thyroid cancer, because the women there, specifically among the women, have a high intake of cruciferous vegetables and a low iodine intake. So basically all I wanted to show, this study just briefly mentions it, but cruciferous vegetables contain thioglucosides that are metabolized to thiocyanates. These compounds inhibit iodine transport and the incorporation of iodide into thyroglobulin, thus increasing TSH secretion and thyroid cell proliferation. In animal experiments, it has been found that substances, here, let me do this. Whoops. It has been found that these substances induce thyroid carcinomas. Another group of potent goitrogens are contained in foods such as cassava or sweet potatoes with a high content of cyanogenic glucosides. In epidemiologic studies, no clear association between thyroid cancer and cruciferous vegetables or other food items containing goitrogens has been demonstrated. So in epidemiologic studies, they're not seeing the relationship, but there is a known mechanism that excessive cruciferous vegetables intake leads to the production of thiocyanates that can inhibit the thyroid's utilization of iodine. And then when the thyroid can't get enough iodine, it can't make adequate thyroid hormone. So TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is a hormone from the pituitary, will increase. And then this increase in TSH will trigger the thyroid gland to actually produce to try to produce thyroid hormone, but also increases the proliferation of these thyroid cells, and then that can lead to an increased risk of thyroid cancer. So minimizing the goitrogenic vegetables would be helpful in this situation. That's all I really wanted to show you guys here, is just that the mechanism does exist. There is research to support it. Last piece was this study. So I wanted to find a study that was somewhat within John's age group. So this study is elevated thyroid stimulating hormone is associated with elevated cortisol in healthy young men and women. So basically the men and women they looked at here, we conducted a cross-sectional study in 24 healthy young. Mean age is 20 years, young men and women. So with, again, mean age of 20 years. They looked at their blood samples for their TSH, T3, T4, and cortisol. And then they looked at the relationships. So what we get to down here, what they start to talk about in this study is that TSH in healthy populations, TSH is closer to that 1.5 mark and not necessarily that 2 mark. So they say in apparently healthy populations, the TSH distribution is skewed toward the lower end of the reference range, with the mean value typically being about 1.5 micro IU per liter, but the range extending from 0.5 to 4.5 micro IU per liter. So then they say, therefore, it is possible that seemingly healthy individuals with TSH levels in the upper end of this range may in fact have elevated TSH in response to early thyroid gland failure, and also should be considered to have subclinical hypothyroidism. This possibility is further supported by the fact that many patients with TSH levels in the 3.0 to 4.5 micro IU per liter range are positive for anti-thyroid antibodies. So essentially, perhaps the TSH range should be adjusted down to maybe 0.5 to 2, and anything over 2 would be possibly problematic. Or maybe in this case, they would say 3. So again, in John's case, he's at the 3.57. We want that to be significantly lower. Just wanted to show you that there. This is another situation. This basically is saying that preliminary study assessed relationship between serum TSH levels and 2.5 to in the 2.5 to 10 micro IU per liter range and serum cortisol in a cohort of healthy young men and women. They go on to say, it has long been known that frank hypothyroidism causes elevated cortisol levels, presumably due to both decreased clearance and blunted negative feedback of cortisol on the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So it is known that hypothyroidism, and also it's known in hypothyroidism, in the hypothyroidism situation, that cortisol is elevated. It's due to decreasing clearance of cortisol and in a decreased feedback on cortisol on the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, just in brief, for anybody who's not aware, the hypothalamus secretes a hormone, CRH, which is corticotropin releasing hormone, that signals the pituitary to release ACTH, which is adrenal corticotropin hormone, which then goes to the adrenal gland and causes the release of cortisol. So the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is the main axis that induces the release of the stress hormone cortisol. And essentially, when cortisol is released, it shuts down this axis to some extent. But in hypothyroidism, that axis is actually, that response of the axis to cortisol gets blunted. So cortisol doesn't shut it down as well. So you have increased cortisol levels in the hypothyroid state. So just something interesting to keep in mind. Now, as with John's situation, he was not technically hypothyroid, maybe borderline. Although, as we're discussed in this previous paragraph, it may have been better to actually have a lower, like the range may actually need to be adjusted, and at his level may be considered subclinical hypothyroidism. Now, John's cortisol level wasn't out of range. It was in range, just towards the higher end of the range. So perhaps his subclinical hypothyroid level isn't raising his cortisol to some extent. So I'm assuming if we fix that hypothyroid state to some extent, or the subclinical hypothyroid state, or the borderline subclinical hypothyroid state, because I guess you would define it correctly here, you'll start to see a drop in those cortisol levels. Just something to keep in mind. The relationship. The last thing I wanted to discuss is basically the outcome of the study. So they said, in other words, serum cortisol levels among individuals with TSH levels greater than 2 were significantly higher than among individuals with TSH levels less than 2. So essentially, if TSH greater than 2, you saw higher cortisol levels. With TSH less than 2, cortisol levels were decreased significantly. So the values in the greater than 2 were about 13.8 micrograms per deciliter versus 8.66 micrograms per deciliter. So keep in mind, these cortisol levels are in range. It's just the hypothyroid group was much higher in range, almost twice as much in range as they're not hypothyroid, but possible subclinical hypothyroid group was much higher in range than the group that was technically euthyroid with a TSH value of less than 2. So just something to keep in mind. That's part of where I'm getting this relationship from in this situation. They just go on here to talk about the changes in feedback loop and increased thyroid hormone levels, or decreasing thyroid hormone levels, increasing cortisol in the rest of the study. That's really what I wanted to cover with you guys today. I just wanted to briefly go over these labs. I am going to go back to making videos on research. The next one's going to come out. It's going to be another one on caloric restriction, on some of the caloric restriction studies and some of the nuances there. This next one's in monkeys instead of rats, so that should be cool. And then maybe we'll get to some of the human studies. And then again, I do have that cardiovascular series that I'm still working on, so stay tuned. Let me know in the comments if you guys like this type of content. I do have quite a bit of labs from different clients, from myself, that I could go over. I'll see if, obviously, with consent of clients, of course. And obviously, I'll continue to take out people's information so that everybody's stuff stays private. So yeah, just keep me posted. Let me know in the comments if you like this stuff, and stay tuned for the next video. I'll see you guys soon.